massive crowd tonight. Very warm welcome, brothers and sisters. Sorry about that little delay there.
You'll need to be
online. This evening, unfortunately, Brother Ben can't be here because he's been a close contact, so we're going to be zooming it tonight on the screen, if you're wondering. But yes, tonight it is going to be Brother Ben on the topic of Nahum. Sorry, I even forgot my hymn book. Sorry about that. But let's first of all open this evening by singing together hymn number 180. O God, Abba, our Father in heaven, we come before thee in prayer now, this night, to first of all to thank thee for this moment in time in which we can come now away from our day-to-day life, in the middle of our week, to come here and to better have a look at the book of Nahum, which is written in your word to us. And we can come here and we can learn some lessons, we can gain some more understanding of the book of Nahum and the things that are written down in it, that we are able now to listen to your word and to be encouraged and uplifted, that we can get some strength as we listen to Ben tonight in his talk, that as we hear your word tonight, we can get help, that it might help us to continue on this week with our hearts guided a little bit more after thee, a little bit more pure, a little bit more like thy son. We thank thee also that we can get strength from one another here tonight, that as we talk to each other, as we fellowship with our brothers and sisters here tonight, that share the same hope, share the same faith, the same love. We thank thee that we have each other, that we can help each other in our walk together as a family striving after the character of thee, our Father. So as we come here this night and as we listen to thy words tonight, we ask you for the blessing upon us and for all those that hear these words tonight, that it might help us in these things. So we ask thee for that blessing, approach thee even through thy beloved Son, our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. You just doubled our midst. Another warm welcome to those that have come in. And as we said tonight, we're going to be have a talk by our brother Ben Derricky, and it's on his second study on Nahum. And tonight's reading is going to be Nahum chapter 1. So I'll read that for you now. The burden of Nineveh, the book of the vision of Nahum the Elkoshite. God is jealous, and the Lord revengeth. The Lord revengeth and is furious. The Lord will take vengeance on his adversaries, and he reserved wrath for his enemies. The Lord is slow to anger and great in power, and will not at all acquit the wicked. The Lord hath his way in the whirlwind and in the storm, and the clouds are the dust of his feet. He rebuketh the sea and maketh it dry, and drieth up all the rivers. Bashan languisheth, and Carmel, and the flower of Lebanon languisheth. The mountains quake at him, and the hills melt, and the earth is burned at his presence, yea, the world and all that dwell therein. Who can stand before his indignation? And who can abide in the fierceness of his anger? His fury is poured out like fire, and the rocks are thrown down by him. The Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble, and he knoweth them that trust in him. But with an overrunning flood, he will make an utter end of the place thereof, and darkness shall pursue his enemies. What do ye imagine against the Lord? He will make an utter end. Affliction shall not rise up the second time. For while they be folding together as thorns, and while they are drunken as drunkards, they shall be devoured as stubble fully dry. There is one come out of thee that imagineth evil against the Lord, a wicked counsellor. Saith the Lord, though they be quiet, and likewise many, yet thus shall they be cut down when he shall pass through. Though I have afflicted thee, I will afflict thee no more. For now will I break his yoke from off thee, and will burst thy bonds in sunder. And the Lord hath given a commandment concerning thee, that no more of thy name be sown. Out of the house of thy gods will I cut off the graven image and the molten image. I will make thy grave, for thou art vile. Behold, upon the mountains the feet of him that bringeth good tidings, that publisheth peace. O Judah, keep thy solemn feast, perform thy vows, for the wicked shall no more pass through thee. He is utterly cut off. And so with that, I'm assuming that Brother Ben will just appear up on the screen in front of you. And we'll now hand over to Brother Ben to the second talk on Nahum.
Good evening, everybody. I trust you can see me. I can see me, so that's a good thing. Let me just flick to my PowerPoint presentation as well. All right. I assume someone will text message me if I go for long enough and you can't hear it or you can't see it or anything like that. Thanks for the few of you that are there tonight. I noticed that there are a few people online through this Zoom feed and also through the YouTube channel as well. Excuse me. And so it's nice to see you all here tonight, and encouraging as well. Thank you. I am a close contact, unfortunately, so I can't be there. Seth got COVID late last week. He's been fine. It's just been little more than a cold basically for him, which has been great. And hopefully tomorrow we're all back into the swing of things. I can go back to work and Seth can go back to school. So we are here for our second night now on the book of Nahum. And I'm hoping tonight that we'll be able to get at least to the end of chapter 1. I'm not quite sure we're going to get there because we've got, we're only covering a few things tonight, but there's a lot of detail behind it all. Hopefully, I don't think it's too much boring detail, but there's a lot of detail behind it all, so we'll see how we go. Now, I'll just do a little recap first for anyone who wasn't here on the first night in class 1. In the previous class, we looked at the historical context to the vision of Nahum. So we saw that as in regards to dating the book of Nahum, we can do that quite easily through chapter 3 in particular. So chapter 3, verse 7 clearly tells us that this prophecy is about the fall of Nineveh. And the fall of Nineveh hasn't happened yet, so that gives us an end point in time for that to have occurred. And we know from history the Assyrians were incredible record keepers through the clay tablets that they kept or through the reliefs that they carved out of rocks and put all around Nineveh and their cities. We know that the fall of Nineveh occurred around 615 BC. And again in chapter 3, in verse 8 to 10, it references the fall of Thebes. In the King James or New King James, it's the no Ammon is what it's referred to, but that's actually referring to the fall of Thebes. So we've got a start point. The fall of Thebes has already occurred at this point in time. And we know the fall of Thebes occurred in around 663 BC. So that gives us a little window of about 50 years where we can say the prophecy of Nineveh took place at some point in here. We also looked at the rise and the expansion of the Assyrian Empire over 1,000 years. At the peak of its expansion, it covered all through Kuwait, modern Kuwait, up through Iraq, up into southern Turkey here, down through Syria, Lebanon, down through Israel, and also parts of the middle of Egypt. Sorry, and you've got Thebes down the bottom here, which was referred to in that verse in chapter 3, verse 8. No Ammon. So you can see it covered a significant amount of territory in its day. And the conquest, its expansion and conquest down into Israel is very well documented historically through the Assyrian records and also biblically. So we saw, firstly, in around 740 BC, Tiglath-Pileser came down and extorted tribute out of the king then. But then 5 years later, Tiglath-Pileser III comes back and conquers this area of Galilee, and takes that under control. 20 years later, he comes down again and he takes out this capital of Samaria, ships all the people off to another country, brings in the residents of that country and puts them into Samaria. And then finally, another 20 years after that, Sennacherib decides to come down and take on Jerusalem. And we know that that event failed. It was the destruction of the Ninevite, of the Assyrian army, and they went on back to Nineveh. At some point after that, that's when Thebes was taken, and also the book of Nahum's prophecy was written as well. We saw briefly how that they were a very barbaric empire. They left, like I said before, they left a lot of reliefs illustrating their conquests. We've got, let me go back there. We've got the slaves, image of the slaves that they took, the war spoils, I guess, with the heads of the soldiers that they took. Over here, we've got the captives that were taken off and placed in other countries. This is, this is the fall of Thebes, by the way, the one we referred to before. So all these fish you can see down here is the image of the Nile, which Thebes was on the banks of. And then we've got the army here. We've got the walls being dug out, undermining the walls. We've got the siege ladders that were thrown up, and the archers and military moving up there while they've got the cover being provided by the archers on the outside with their shields, slowly trying to take over the city. And obviously we know in this case it was very successful, and Thebes was taken into captivity. And they mastered the art of terror and putting fear into the nation and into those countries that they were going to, or into the cities that they were going to take on. And this was one example. We'll just read the little bit in red. This is the record of Ashurnazirpal, who said, "I built a pillar over against the city gate, and I flayed all the chiefs who had revolted against Nineveh, and I covered the pillar with their skins." And over again, these sort of, he continues on through this section here, very graphic about what he did. And this was something that they continually recorded, and also left out the front of their cities that they conquered as a message to anyone else who came past, that the Assyrians were not to be messed with. And this is what was going to happen. And you might as well give up fighting now, because, look how powerful we are. And then, excuse me, off the back of this enforced slavery that they did, the deportation, the looting of the cities that they captured, off the tribute that they demanded of their vassal states that they ruled over. They built one of the greatest cities that has ever been. And this is an artist's rendition of what Nineveh was like in its heyday, and built off the back of this luxurious extravagance, built on the back of human suffering and pain. And it was that suffering and pain and terror that was which brought around this prophecy where God said, enough is enough. It's time for me to step in here because you've crossed the line and taken things too far. And so that's where we get to Nahum. One bit of context that I didn't cover last class, and that was the warning that Nineveh had already received from Jonah around 150 years earlier. So let's just come back to Jonah for a minute, because I believe that the book of Jonah really sets the scene for Nahum's writings in two particular ways. Firstly, from that historical context, a little bit more history in regards to what had occurred, but also from a literary context as well. So Jonah 1, I'm sure you're all familiar with the story of Jonah, so we're not going to go over it in any particular detail, but there are a couple of things I want to note in particular. So let's start Jonah 1, verse 1 and 2. Now, and I'm reading from the New King James. Now the word of Yahweh came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, "Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry out against it, for their wickedness has come up before me." So just a bit of context. This is the warning that Nineveh first received. It's the Jonah being told to go to Nineveh and tell them that what they were doing, what their wickedness was, and the wickedness is never described in this book, unlike it is in Nahum. The wickedness, we never really get much detail on it, but go to Nineveh and tell them that their wickedness has come up before Yahweh. So now come over a couple of pages, or a page probably, to Jonah chapter 3. So we've been through that, Jonah trying to leave the country, out from Joppa, the storm rising when he's on the boat, he's thrown into the ocean, the fish swallows him, the fish vomits him up onto the land, and so we pick it up again here, where Yahweh comes to Jonah the second time, and let's read from verse 2, where he says, "Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and preach to it the message that I tell you." So Jonah arose and went to Nineveh according to the word of Yahweh. Now Nineveh was an exceedingly great city, a 3-day journey in extent. And Jonah began to enter the city on the first day's walk. Then he cried out and said, "Yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown." So here we have that continuation, that the first warning that's actually made it to Nineveh. This warning that they need to change their ways, that it's going to be overthrown, something's going to happen. And Jonah passes that message on to them. And then we go on and we see the reaction, and we all know it. We see the reaction of the people and the king to Jonah's words in verse 5, where the people of Nineveh believed God. They proclaimed a fast and put on sackcloth, from the greatest to the least of them. And then in verse 7, and he caused it, this is the king of Nineveh, caused it to be proclaimed and published throughout Nineveh by the decree of the king and his nobles, saying, "Neither man nor beast, herd nor flock taste anything. Do not let them eat or drink water, but let the man and beast be covered in sackcloth and cry mightily to God. Yes, let everyone turn from his evil way and from the violence that is in his hands. Who can tell if God will turn and relent and turn away from his fierce anger so that we may not perish?" And so we've got this picture now of the reaction of the Ninevites to this demand. 40 days, Nineveh is going to be overthrown. And we see their focus is on their deeds. Their focus is and reaction is we need to change what we're doing. And who knows whether this God is not called Yahweh here, whether God, the God of this person who's just walked in, will turn and relent. Will he change from his fierce anger? So we've got these concepts of repentance for actions and also for forgiveness and graciousness through Yahweh. So that's the reaction, and that's the view of the Ninevites on those two topics. Then we get a summary of Yahweh's reaction in verse 10. God saw their works, that they turned from their evil ways, and God relented from the disaster that he said he would bring upon them and did not do it. And so we see that Yahweh is willing to forgive. Jonah, in this story of Jonah, Yahweh is showing that he is willing to forgive and he will relent from the disaster if people change their ways. And then Jonah gives us commentary on it as well. In verse 2, chapter 4, verse 2. So I prayed to Yahweh and said, "Hey, Yahweh, was this not what I said when I was still in my country? Therefore I fled previously to Tarshish, for I know that you are a gracious and merciful God, slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, one who relents from doing harm." And so Jonah now is confessing. Yahweh is gracious. He's slow to anger. Take note of that, slow to anger. He's abundant in loving kindness. And we get a final picture through a rhetorical question at the end of the chapter in verse 11, where God's talking to Jonah and saying, "Should I not pity Nineveh, that great city in which more than 120,000 persons who cannot discern between their right hand and their left, and much livestock?" And so again, this final commentary, we have iterated again Yahweh's compassion, and Yahweh is being slow to anger and willing to forgive for people who change their ways. And it finishes it with this odd rhetorical question. And that's how the book ends. And it's this section here in particular, from verse 7, I guess, or maybe verse 5 of chapter 3 to the end of chapter 4, where we get the reaction of everybody, and we get this continual summary of the love of God and the slow to anger nature of God and his willingness to forgive, but also the fact that he is a fierce, angry God, and he will create disaster. And it's seeing those concepts picked up in these last few verses, which are immediately picked up in the book of Nahum. And I sort of feel like Nahum was channeling Jonah, because this prophecy was written, or this prophecy occurred 150 years before Nahum prophesied, around 150 years. So potentially he would have known about what he said. So come back to Nahum now, and let's have a look at how this is potentially is channeled by Nahum. So Jonah's book finishes showing God's desire to punish for its wickedness, but noting he's a God who is slow to anger. He'll relent from his anger if he sees a change of lifestyle. Nahum picks these up let's start from Nahum 1, verse 1. The burden against Nineveh, the book of the vision of Nahum, the Elkoshite. God is jealous, and Yahweh avenges. Yahweh avenges and is furious. Yahweh will take vengeance on his adversaries. He reserves wrath for his enemies. Yahweh is slow to anger. Pick that word up from Jonah. And great in power, and will not all acquit the wicked. So immediately it's almost like we've picked it back up again. We've picked the story of Jonah back up again, picking up those concepts. We're starting off now, reminding ourselves that God is slow to anger and that he is a gracious God and he does forgive. But once he gets that fierce anger that the Ninevites were worried about, he will take that. He will take that action as he sees fit. And so you were immediately drawn to that. And then it's like he closes out the same way too. Because if you come over to chapter 3 and have a look how the book ends in chapter 3, verse 18 and 19. So this is Nahum now talking to, through the prophecy to the king of Assyria. Your shepherds slumber, O king of Assyria. Your nobles rest in dust. Your people are scattered on the mountains, and no one gathers them. Your injury has no healing. Your wound is severe. All who hear news of you will clap their hands over you. For upon whom has not your wickedness passed continually? And so Nahum, like Jonah, finishes this finishes his small prophecy with a rhetorical question as well. In Jonah, it's a rhetorical question about God's desire to forgive Nineveh. And in the end of Nahum, it's about God's desire to destroy Nineveh. And both of them are at the hands of the Medes and Persians, the hands of the Babylonians and Medes, sorry. So the only two biblical books that end with a question, and with a rhetorical question at that, are Jonah and Nahum. And so I really feel this book of Nahum seems to pick up and carry on where Jonah left off. Maybe so future readers can see and can make that connection that God is a forgiving God, as illustrated through Jonah. But he'll no means clear the guilty, as illustrated through Nahum. So having had a look then through at that, looked at the historical context in our previous class and briefly at the start of this, and also a bit of literary context to Nahum's prophecy. What do we know about him as a person? Well, there are a lot of facts. Sorry, there are a few facts. There are a lot of theories. So, excuse me, let's start by having a look at the facts first. Okay, so Nahum's name in Hebrew means consolation or comforter. So that's a fact. That's easy to find out and determine. And I guess in some ways his message does provide comfort and consolation if you do name meanings. It was a comfort to Judah and the surrounding nations that Nineveh and Assyria's oppression and their barbaric warfare would soon depart. Like that last verse of chapter 3 said with that rhetorical question, all who hear news of you will clap their hands over you. Really vivid imagery of the celebration of the fall of Nineveh and the fall of the Assyrian Empire by everyone who's been trampled on and damaged by this Assyrian Empire. And for us too, it should give us some comfort too, because it shows us God's involvement in the world. It shows us about his forgiveness. It shows us about the fact that he's slow to anger and willing to work with people, and that is something that should be of comfort to us as well. And hopefully we'll look at some of those themes in our next class. His name only, or the name Nahum only appears definitely twice, possibly 3 times. So in Nehemiah 7 verse 7, in the genealogies that Nehemiah records, there's a name there which is recorded as Nehum, Nehum. It's a slightly different name, but still very similar. And it might be a reference to a Nahum, but not a connection to Nahum the Elkoshite. We saw it in our reading tonight in Nahum 1 verse 1, with the book of the vision of Nahum. And also it appears in the genealogy of Jesus in Luke 3 verse 25. It also references another Nahum. But there's no connections between them that are identifiable, and so nothing can be gained by trying to piece them together and see if it gives us some picture of who this Nahum the Elkoshite was. There are also, for what it's worth, there's some speculation about in Ezra there's a name called Rehum, Rehum, and there's some potential linkages between that and the Nehum in Nehemiah, but it's just getting murkier and murkier, isn't it? The further you go down that route, trying to work it all out. So basically, there's very little that we know about Nahum from his name that we can trace through biblical history. Finally, Elkoshite is only used in Nahum 1 verse 1. There's nothing else recorded about the name biblically or historically. And so there's nothing that we can really gain from trying to understand who the Elkoshites were, if it even was a tribe of people. And so, you're probably not going to be surprised that there's also a number of theories about him, given the mix of the limited number of facts about him. And while they're not provable, I do think they're good to consider, because in going through them myself, makes you think through things a little bit, expands your understanding of how biblical interpretation works, and I think it's good value. So let's have a look at some of the theories around who Nahum was. So firstly, Jerome, the 5th century Catholic priest, he noted that there was a village called Elkozer, something like that, in Galilee, and speculated that could be Elkozer, could be Elko, where the Elkoshites were from, and maybe that's where Nahum was from, in the north of Israel, up around Galilee. But again, there's no evidence for this. This one sort of made me smile a bit, just because it seems so obvious in hindsight, but I didn't actually know that it was the case. Capernaum actually means the village of Nahum. So obviously it's anglicised, but the Caper element of it is the word for village, and the Nahum is the Hebrew word for Nahum. And so Capernaum, called the village of Nahum, would have been nice and easy. Would have been fantastic if that was where it was from, because everything would have made sense, and it's all really obvious and not very cryptic for us to find. But unfortunately, there's just no evidence to connect Capernaum with the prophet either. There's a location that's known and venerated as the tomb of Nahum, which is located in Al-Kush, which sounds a little bit like Al-Kush in Iraq. And that's just outside Mosul, which is pretty much where the ruins of Nineveh are. Mosul's in the Nineveh Governorate, one of the provinces, I guess, of Iraq. And so there's that location there. But I think the earliest reference to the tomb of Nahum in Al-Kush in Iraq was around from the 16th century. And, that's the 16th century AD. When Nahum was around in the 7th century BC, that's a significant time lapse between the life of the prophet and the finding of his tomb. And so it's pretty unlikely that was the place where he was buried. Some speculated that maybe it was added to that argument that maybe it was from Galilee or northern Israel around Capernaum, because he discusses in chapter 1, verse 4, which we read tonight, he talks about Bashan and Carmel and Lebanon and those sort of regions. So potentially is familiar with those regions because he's quoting them. But again, Bashan and Carmel and Lebanon are pretty famous sort of areas, and you'd think most people in the north or south would have known about them. And there's some speculation too that he might have actually either been a captive who went to Nineveh, because he is so able to describe what he saw in Nineveh. In chapter 2, verse 3, if you have a look at chapter 2, verse 3, we get a, hang on, sorry. There was another one I was going to go to first. But anyway, in chapter 2, verse 3, we've got the descriptions of the army, the shields of the mighty men, the valiant men in scarlet, the chariots like flaming torches, the spears and the chariots and so on. So we've got those sort of a vivid description of the army. In chapter 2, verse 6, it talks about the gates of the rivers being opened, and the palaces dissolved, and Nineveh had, like we talked in study 1, significant use of aqueducts to get water into the city and through the city. And so that indicates a bit of an understanding of how it worked there as well. Verse 9 of chapter 2, take spoil of silver, take spoil of gold. There's no end of her treasure or wealth. So again, potentially having seen the luxuriousness of the city and the extravagance of the city, Nahum's able to refer to those sort of things. But again, for me, I think those things would have been well communicated across the empire and across borders by travelling traders or by refugees or other travellers as well. So a lot of that stuff could easily just have been common knowledge of this, incredible location of Nineveh. I sort of gave it a bit of thought, and again, not that I think any of this is provable, but my thoughts are that Nahum was possibly, that's probably a better word, possibly from the southern tribes and not from the northern regions, as we see through this Jerome statement about Galilee and Capernaum and up in Iraq, and the fact that he knows these northern areas sort of seems a lot of push through these different ideas, and these were from multiple resources, not just one source of information. But I think he potentially is from the southern region of Israel, and I'll just take you quickly through my theories, because again, this while it is not provable, it still opens up this book of Nahum a bit more too. So there's value in going through that and just sort of testing ideas. So firstly, if Nahum was from the south of Israel, that's one of my theories. Because if he was from the north, if you remember when Nahum's prophecy was written, it was after the fall of the north. So Samaria and Galilee had fallen to the Assyrians, and they'd been taken off into captivity. And so if he was a refugee or an escapee who managed to get away from being taken into captivity, or managed to flee from the destruction of his city, it probably makes it a little less likely that it was him, for me, I think, because of that demand for this sort of thing to have taken place for him to make it down. Also, he references Isaiah a couple of times. So if you have a look in chapter 1, verse 15, chapter 1, verse 15, it says, behold on the mountains the feet of him who brings good tidings, who proclaims peace, O Judah, keep your appointed feast, perform your vows, and so on. This is a direct quote taken from Isaiah 52. It definitely seems to be referencing Isaiah. And Isaiah was written about 50 years, I think, before, or Isaiah's prophecies occurred around 50 years before Nahum's. So in Isaiah 52, it says, how beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him who brings good tidings, who publishes peace. So we see Nahum picking up on the words of Isaiah. And also we've got another reference as well in, like I had up there, it references Isaiah. Have a look at chapter 1, verse 8. Chapter 1, verse 8, we've got this description of the destruction of Nineveh. Let's just go to verse 7 to start with. Yahweh is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble, and he knows those who trust in him. But with an overflowing flood, he will make an utter end of its place, and darkness will pursue his enemies. Just hold your hand here quickly and quickly come back to Isaiah chapter 8, because this imagery of a flood overtaking Nineveh, overtaking Assyria, is used by Isaiah as well, and it's actually used in regards to Assyria in Isaiah. So we're in Isaiah chapter 8, and I'll start at verse 5. Isaiah 8, verse 5. Yahweh also spoke to me again, saying, inasmuch as these people refuse the waters of Shiloah that flow softly, and rejoice in Rezin and Remaliah's son, now therefore, behold, the Lord brings up over them the waters of the river, strong and mighty. The king of Assyria and all his glory will go up over all his channels, or go up and overflow, I think the King James says, and go over all his banks. He will pass through Judah. He will overflow and pass over. He will reach up to the neck with the stretching out of his wings, and will fill the breadth of your land, O Emmanuel. And so Isaiah is using this really vivid imagery of the king of Assyria and all his glory flowing up over its channels, overflowing its banks, overtaking through Judah. And if you want to write a reference in there, if you haven't got it, 2 Kings 18, verse 3, around that, where it talks about passing through Judah. 2 Kings 18, verse 13, not verse 3. And that's talking about when Sennacherib comes down, when he's on his way down to take out Jerusalem, takes out some of the region, the areas of Judah as he comes down to Jerusalem. And so that's talking about that particular conquest there. And that word in verse 8, just after overflow, and go over all his banks, is that same word of back in Nahum chapter 1, in verse 8, the overflowing. So we've got that same word there. So Nahum's potentially picking up on the same imagery that Isaiah had used to talk about what was going to happen with Assyria. And I'd like to imagine the idea that, because Isaiah was from the south, he was prophesying in Judah, that if Nahum was down in the south, was down in Judah, he's meeting up with Isaiah, who prophesied before him, and they're talking through the prophecies that they've been given, trying to, and Nahum saying, well, I received this vision and this is going to happen, and Isaiah's talking about, the flood, I used these words to describe what was going to happen, and I imagine the prophets would have got together and discussed things. So potentially, maybe there's something there about that as well. Just quickly, so there's some encouragement for Judah that's given. Chapter 1, verse 15, which we read, and also in chapter 2, verse 2, he speaks specifically to Judah. He couldn't speak to Israel because Israel was in captivity, but so potentially he's down offering that advice to Judah. And finally, what we discussed before, he references the fall of Thebes, which occurred in 663 BC, and occurred after the fall of the north. So if he was from the north and the north was taken into captivity, the time from there to his prophecy was probably about 80 years. So depending on how old he was at the north, when it fell, it would make him quite a reasonably old man at this point to come down, if he came down from the northern tribes, or if he was from the northern tribes. So Potentially, I like to think, if nothing else, that that is from the southern tribes. And so, having had a look now at the context, and then now having a look what we do and don't know about Nahum, we get to chapter 1. And if you're anything like me, when I first read chapter 1, it went from really easy to understand in the first half to really cryptic and difficult to piece together in the second half. And if you're not familiar with that second half of the book, it is difficult to make sense, because who is being spoken about seems to chop and change. Sometimes it appears to be Judah, sometimes it appears to be Nineveh, but it's all in one section. And so it's a little bit hard to interpret. So let's just spend a couple of minutes now just finishing up, having a look at some of the keys to pulling apart and understanding chapter 1. So that the first section that we read kicks off by illustrating Yahweh's strength. And that starts with that section in verse 2. God is jealous, Yahweh avenges in furious. And for me, it finishes in verse 7. Yahweh is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble, and he knows who trusts in him. And he's got, so we've got this section at the start, which is illustrating the power and the strength of God, and how people who know him can trust in him and find him as their stronghold in a day of trouble. And Nahum uses the imagery of nature to really illustrate Yahweh's strength. Because ultimately, like, who can control the weather? Who can fight against weather? Have a look at some of those expressions. So in chapter 1, looking at halfway through verse 3, Yahweh has his way in the whirlwind and in the storm, and the clouds are the dust of his feet. Verse 4, he rebukes the sea and makes it dry. So he's got power over the sea. In verse, he dries up the rivers. He's got power over the rivers. Bashan and Carmel, luxurious, fertile areas, would wither under him. The flowers of Lebanon wilts. Mountains quake before him. The hills melt. The earth heaves at his presence. It's got this imagery of like earthquakes and the hills melting and collapsing on, as the mountains shake. At the end of verse 6, his fury is poured out like fire, and the rocks are thrown down by him, or other translations have the rocks are broken into pieces, or boulders are broken up. And so you've got this really vivid imagery of Yahweh's ultimate power being manifested and shown through his control of nature. Nations come and go, weapons increase in complexity in how lethal they are, in the damage they can do. But who can fight against the sea? Who can fight if you're in the Navy and the sea is churning, or if you're in the army and the heat is blistering and relentless, or if the ground is flooded through storms or is muddy? And we've seen some of these things play out in Ukraine, where the weather has affected the Russian advance and limited the Russian advance. If the air is frigid and the snow is blistering and pelting down, like what does it matter how big a nation you are if you're as big as Assyria and have an army as big as Assyria, or or a city as beautiful as Nineveh, or all the weaponry of Russia? What good is that when nature is against you? There is nothing that you can do about the weather. And Nahum is picking up this to start with. And he says it in verse 6, who can stand before his indignation, and who can endure the fierceness of his anger? No one can. No one can. No one can fight against nature, and nature that is in God's control. And so we have that opening section there where Nahum starts off with the power of God, Doesn't matter how big and how powerful this Assyrian Empire is. God is more powerful. He is slow to anger, but he's great in power. And so we get down then to verse 8, which is like a bridging verse, I guess, from the power of God and those who trust in him through to now the judgment that's going to commence on Nineveh. With an overflowing flood, he will make an utter end of its place. The RSV for its place has adversaries, or ESV, the adversaries. Other translations, more dynamic translations, drop Nineveh's name in there. The NET, NIV. He will make an utter end of the adversaries, or of Nineveh. And then verse 9 starts the conversation with Nineveh. And I think this is where these sections here from verse 9 through to the end of the chapter get really complicated. But with it, it's when you simply break them down, I think it makes a lot more sense. And it all comes back in a lot of cases to the context, looking at who's writing and who's speaking, and what we know about some of that context. So we know, to start with, in this section from verse 9 to 11, that this is Nahum speaking. Okay? It's the burden of Nineveh, verse 1, the book of the vision of Nahum. Nahum starts writing. It's not Yahweh talking here, because he says in verse 9, what do you conspire against Yahweh? He doesn't say, what do you conspire against me? He goes on, he says, he, so Yahweh, will make an utter end of it. And at the end of verse 11, from you comes forth one who plots evil against Yahweh. So again, it's talking about Yahweh. It's Nahum talking about Yahweh. And I've put up this chart here, which might make a little bit of sense. And we'll go through these sections. So that section from verse 9 to 11 is clearly Nahum speaking. It's clearly speaking to Nineveh. From you comes forth one who plots against Yahweh in verse 11. And it's clearly, obviously, referring to Nineveh. But then when you get to verse 12, this is where it changes. And it's important to note what it says in verse 12, because it says here, thus saith Yahweh, though they are safe. So now we've got a change in who's speaking. As we can see on our little matrix there, we've got Yahweh speaking. Though they are safe. So Yahweh is now talking about Nineveh. Now Nineveh is safe, and many, yet in this manner they'll be cut down. So here Yahweh is talking to Judah about Nineveh. Though Nineveh are safe, and likewise many, yet in this manner will they be cut down when he passes through. Though I have afflicted you, Judah, I will afflict you no more, for I will break off his, Nineveh, yoke from you, Judah, and burst your bonds apart. Okay, so I think, for me, in my Bible, where it says at the start of verse 12, thus saith Yahweh, I've written in brackets to Judah. So it says, thus saith Yahweh to Judah. And then we get to verse 14, and we get to another section. And here we have another statement. Yahweh has given a command concerning you. So this is Nahum writing that one little bit. Yahweh has given a command about you. And then he's quoting Yahweh's words in verse 14. Your name shall be perpetuated no longer. Out of the house of your gods, I will cut off the carved image and the molded image. I will dig your grave, for you are vile. So this is Yahweh now talking to Nineveh, about Nineveh. And again, I think to make it easier for me, what I've done with verse 14 said, Yahweh has given a command concerning you, Assyria, or you, Nineveh. So you know there's that change in who's being spoken to that occurs. And then we get to verse 15. And now we get back to Nahum speaking. And Nahum is observing and commenting on the good news, on the outcome of this. Yahweh said he's going to judge Nineveh. He's going to set you free, Judah. I'm going to Nineveh. I'm going to cut you down. I'm going to, your name's not going to be around anymore. I'm going to cut off the carved images and so on. And then we pick it back up again in this almost like a chronological story, I guess, of some sorts, where Nahum now picks up in verse 15. And you can see the quotation marks finish at the end of verse 14. So that section, that quotation from Yahweh is finished. Nahum now steps back in. Behold on the mountains, quoting Isaiah, the feet of him who brings good tidings, who proclaims feasts. O Judah, keep your appointed feast, perform your vows, for the wicked one shall no more pass through you. He is utterly cut off. And so this now is Nahum talking to Judah. And he's telling Judah about what's going to happen. There's going to be good news. Good news is coming. This is the the good news is coming. You're going to be able to proclaim your feast again. You're going to be able to continue. And so this first chapter it really sort of sets out quite neatly, I think, the majesty and power that God has through his control of the elements and what he can do when his righteous anger is roused sufficiently. And then how that all is going to play out with Nineveh. It's going to come on it like a flood. He's going to look after Judah, but he's going to destroy Nineveh. And when we get to chapter 2, then we start to pull apart how that destruction takes place. And it's quite vivid when you create all the sections or understand all the sections about how that whole chronology of the battle is going to take place. And so somehow we've managed to squeeze all that in till 9 o'clock. And so in our next class, in a fortnight's time, I think it is, God willing, we'll have a look at chapters 2 and 3. And if we've got sufficient time, we'll draw out some of the really spiritual and strong lessons that come out of it. Thanks, Brooke.
Cool. Thank you, Ben. I don't know if you're still there, but thank you, Ben, for your talk tonight. Very encouraging and motivation for us as we see prophecies and stuff that happens in the book that actually come to pass, and that strengthens our own faith and belief in what God has promised for us that will come to pass for us as well. So thanks, Ben. As far as announcements goes, next Wednesday, there are the care group readings. So it's not going to be a talk here. It's going to be organised by the care group readings next Wednesday. And so now let's close by singing together hymn 182. Close in prayer. O God, Yahweh, you are the only true God. You are the creator of everything in existence. You are our God. Your word is true. Your word is final. Your word is powerful. And to those that listen, to those that do, your word is salvation. So we thank you that you have spoken to us through your word tonight in the book of Nahum. We thank you that you have revealed to us books like Nahum in which we can read, which we can study, and which we can be exposited on. And in doing so, we can see that your word does stand true. We can see your word and prophecies come to pass as we look back with the proof of history. And from this, we can gain strength, we can gain encouragement and motivation of your promises to us. So we thank you that we've had this night. And as we leave this night, we pray thee that you might help us to take with us the lessons that we have learned, the encouragement we have gained to put our faith in thee, the motivation we've been inspired with to love you, or to love more and more, to want to reflect your character. As we've seen tonight in the book of Nahum, we cannot deny your power. We can see your power as we have seen it demonstrated tonight against the power and the might of Syria. So it is to thee only that we bend our heads in worship, that we bend our heads in prayer. It is to thee only that we ask for strength, for encouragement now as we leave here. We ask thee that as we go back into our everyday day life, that we might take with us the encouragement that we have gained this night, that it might strengthen us and help us to continue on in our service to thee, in our service to our brethren and sisters, in our service to our family, our ecclesial family, that our dedication, that our focus might be on fulfilling your word in us. So we ask you for your strength, and to thee alone do we pray and ask for this. And so as we are blessed with so much in this world which you have given us, we thank you that now at the end of this night we can have food, that we can have drink which we can enjoy, that we have each other which we can fellowship with and talk with and be strengthened with. We thank you for these blessings, and we're mindful of our brothers and sisters in war-torn countries like Ukraine, or those of our brothers and sisters in Sri Lanka which are suffering and do not have the blessings that we have as such, that you might be with them and bless them and help them and be with them, we pray. So be with us all in these last days, that we might strengthen one another and encourage each other to that end, the end of being with you and your Son in that kingdom. So we leave now this night, even approaching thee through our beloved Lord and our Saviour, even Jesus Christ. Amen.